Hello, welcome to Hidden History, an Odyssey Through Time. I'm your host, John Rodriguez, and welcome to the best history podcast in New York State. They say all good things come to an end, and here we are, my friends. This is the final episode of the podcast, episode 35, and the title of this episode is Devotion to Duty, Private First Class Emory L. Bennett and the Forgotten War. After the defeat of Nazi Germany during World War II, the world barely had a break before a new enemy emerged, with Nazis being replaced by communists. The end of World War II also resulted in the rise of two new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Both nations were interested in expanding their influence and protecting their interests around the world. The Cold War began in March 1947 when President Harry S. Truman presented the Truman Doctrine before a joint session of Congress. President Truman asked Congress for $400 million in military and economic assistance for Turkey and Greece so that those two countries would not fall to communism. President Truman developed a policy of containment in which the United States pledged military, economic, and political assistance to any nation threatened by Soviet-supported communist movements. The Cold War, however, was not a war in the traditional sense. Instead, it was fought with propaganda, a nuclear arms race, space race, covert operations, and proxy wars. And while we are on the subject of proxy wars, after the Second World War, the Soviet Union and the United States both occupied half of Korea and accepted the surrender of the Japanese in that region, effectively splitting the country into two along the 38th parallel. Under the influence of the Soviet Union, a communist government was put in place in North Korea. South Korea, led by anti-communist dictator Syngman Rhee, maintained close ties to the United States. All good? Not at all. On June 25, 1950, the Korean War began when North Korean forces invaded South Korea by crossing over the 38th parallel with the support of the Soviet Union and soon after Communist China. By July 1950, American troops were committed to the war in Korea, and this is where the hero of this story shows up. In July 1950, a 20-year-old Floridian named Emory Lawrence Bennett enlisted in the U.S. Army. Almost 1 year later, Emory L. Bennett would sacrifice his life in a war overshadowed by the Second World War. Emory L. Bennett's story, hidden history that has remained long forgotten, is the story of just one of the many American heroes that perished during the Korean War and the first major conflict of the Cold War against the evils of communism that threatened democracy around the globe. Emory Lawrence Bennett was born on December 20th, 1929 in New Smyrna Beach, Florida, the fourth son of Sterling G. and Stella Bennett. When Emory was 6 years old, he and his family moved to Indianola on Merritt Island, Florida, and then to the city of Cocoa, Florida in 1937. Emory's parents ran Bennett's Fish Market, and an avid fisherman, Emory helped catch fish in the nearby Indian River to sell. The family supplemented their diet by duck hunting, and Emory proved a crack shot. Many years later, an old childhood friend had the following to say about Emory. He loved the outdoors and he loved that river. As a friend, Emory was the sort of man you could rely on. I guess everybody who knew him would tell you he was reliable. Emory continued his education at the local schools in the county and then went on to Cocoa High School. While there, he began to display his leadership potential and was presented with the American Legion Certificate of School Award for his efforts. High school graduation came in June 1948, and although a good student, limited family income meant Emory would not be able to attend one of the state colleges. The jobs that followed were not really career-enhancing, although by 1950, Emory was employed as a lineman at the Florida Power and Light Company. The year 1950 would turn out to be a big one. Only 5 years after the end of World War II, on June 25, 1950, the Korean War began. The enemy was no longer the Nazis, it was the communists. And 1 month after the outbreak of hostilities in Korea, on July 25, 1950, Emory L. Bennett enlisted in the U.S. Army. Basic training was conducted at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, with continuing engineer training at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Once basic training was complete in January 1951, Bennett then proceeded to Fort Lawton, Washington. While at Fort Lawton, the needs of the service dictated a transfer to the infantry, with a short infantry course following. The new infantryman soon departed the United States for Korea, reporting on March 25, 1951 to B Company, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Division. Bennett saw his first combat 6 days later, and a promotion to Private First Class and an award of the Combat Infantryman's Badge quickly followed. Before we continue with Bennett's story, I would like to discuss the Korean War and how it came to be, since it's often labeled the Forgotten War. If even one American dies during a war, that war should never be forgotten. The Korean War is often overshadowed by the immensity of World War II and the uncertainty of the Cold War. So now, without further ado, let's dive right in. Since the beginning of the 1900s, the Empire of Japan had control over the country of Korea. At the end of World War II, Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan were defeated. It fell to the United States and the Soviet Union to decide what should be done with their enemies' possessions, which included the country of Korea. The Soviet Union, Japan, and China were longtime rivals for control of influence in Korea. After 35 years of Japanese colonial rule, the Soviet Union saw the liberation of Korea as an opportunity to extend their regional influence. Although the United States was new to this rivalry, President Franklin D. Roosevelt felt that it was necessary to make a plan to avoid communist rule in Korea. In fact, President Roosevelt had been the first to introduce the idea of a shared trusteeship of Korea by the Allied powers during earlier conferences arranged to discuss the post-war balance of power. In August 1945, the United States, now led by President Harry S. Truman after the death of President Roosevelt in April 1945, and the Soviet Union divided the Korean peninsula in half along the area north of latitude 38 degrees north, or the 38th parallel. Over the next 3 years, 1945 to 1948, the Soviet Army and its proxies set up a communist regime in the area north of the 38th parallel, while in the south, a military government was formed, supported directly by the United States. In 1948, the United States called for a United Nations-sponsored vote for all Koreans to determine the future of the peninsula. The North refused to participate, and by the end of the decade, 2 new states had formed on the Korean peninsula. In the South, the anti-communist dictator Syngman Rhee enjoyed the reluctant support of the American government. And in the North, the communist dictator Kim Il-sung, grandfather of the dictator of North Korea today, Kim Jong-un, enjoyed the slightly more enthusiastic support of the Soviets. A dictator cannot be confined to a single space, however, and border skirmishes were common along the 38th parallel. Thousands of North and South Korean soldiers were killed in battle before the war even began. Finally, on June 25, 1950, the Northern Korean People's Army invaded South Korea in a coordinated general attack at several strategic points along the 38th parallel, the line dividing communist North Korea from the non-communist Republic of Korea in the south. North Korea aimed to militarily conquer South Korea and therefore unify Korea under the communist North Korean regime. The North Korean invasion came as an alarming surprise to officials in the United States, although I'm not sure why it was a surprise. Common sense tells you that when you have 2 dictators sharing a landmass, eventually one of those dictators will want to control the entire landmass. Either way, as far as the United States were concerned, this was not simply a border dispute between 2 unstable dictatorships on the other side of the globe. Instead, many feared it was the first step in a communist campaign to take over the world. For this reason, non-intervention was not considered an option by many top decision makers. It's also important to note that the North Korean invasion was the first military action of the Cold War. By June 28, 1950, North Korean forces had captured Seoul, South Korea's capital city. Concerned that the Soviet Union and Communist China might have encouraged this invasion, In July 1950, President Harry S. Truman committed United States air, ground, and naval forces to the combined United Nations forces, assisting the Republic of Korea in its defense against communist aggression. President Truman designated General Douglas MacArthur as commanding general of the United Nations Command. The first several months of the war were categorized by armies advancing and retreating up and down the Korean peninsula. The initial North Korean attack drove United Nations command forces to a narrow perimeter around the port of Pusan in the southern tip of the peninsula. After the front stabilized at the Pusan perimeter, General MacArthur surprised the North Koreans in September 1950 with an amphibious landing at Incheon behind North Korean lines, forcing the North Koreans to retreat behind the 38th parallel. The South Korean capital Seoul was also recaptured from the communists. In October 1950, the United Nations, urged by the United States, approved the movement of UN forces across the 38th parallel into North Korea in an effort to unify the country under a non-communist government. In spite of warnings issued by Communist China, the United Nations forces moved towards the Yalu River, which marked the border between North Korea and China. In late November 1950, the Chinese attacked in full strength, pushing the United Nations command in disarray south of the 38th parallel, with communist forces seizing the South Korean capital Seoul by January 1951. On March 7, 1951, the Fourth Battle of Seoul took place, with the Chinese offensive losing its momentum and the United Nations command, bolstered by the revitalized 8th U.S. Army, retaking Seoul, South Korea, and advancing back to the 38th parallel. This battle ended on April 4, 1951, with United Nations victory. 2 months later, in June 1951, Private First Class Emory L. Bennett would go above and beyond the call of duty, sacrificing his life for the nation he loved. June 24, 1951, Sobangsan, Korea. It was around 2 a.m. Korea time when 2 communist battalions swarmed up the ridgeline in a ferocious, enthusiastic charge. The enemy's goal was to break up Company B, 15 Infantry Regiment's defensive positions. Meeting the challenge, the courageous American forces delivered destructive retaliation, but the enemy pressed the assault with fanatical determination, and the strength of the perimeter that Company B had set up was in trouble. Fully aware of the odds against him, Private First Class Emory L. Bennett left his foxhole without hesitation, and moving through withering gunfire, he stood within full view of the enemy, and employing his automatic rifle, poured crippling bullets into the ranks of the advancing communists, killing a number of men. Although wounded, Private First Class Bennett gallantly maintained his one-man defense, and the attack was momentarily halted. During this pause in battle, Company B regrouped for a counterattack, but the enemy outnumbered them and advanced into the perimeter set up by the Americans. When the men were ordered to withdraw, Private First Class Bennett voluntarily remained to provide cover fire for the withdrawing troops, and, defying the enemy, continued to sweep the charging foe with a wave of devastating bullets until Bennett was finally mortally wounded. He was only 21 years old when he died. Private First Class Emory L. Bennett's willing sacrifice and intrepid actions saved the position from being completely overrun and enabled Company B to pull off an orderly withdrawal. Private First Class Bennett's unflinching courage and consummate devotion to duty reflect lasting glory on himself and military service to our nation. As the war in Korea raged on, American officials worked anxiously to fashion some sort of peace with the North Koreans. The alternative, they feared, would be a wider war with Russia and China, or even, as some warned, World War III. By the late spring of 1951, the battle lines had stabilized around the area of the 38th parallel, which had previously divided the two Koreas prior to the invasion. On June 23, 1951, with no further progress in sight for the communist forces, the Soviet Union, which backed North Korea, called for armistice talks. On July 10, 1951, peace talks began at Kaesong, North Korea, and eventually continued at Panmunjom, a village just north of the 38th parallel. By August 23, 1951, the communists were done with peace negotiations. UN forces continued to put pressure on the communist forces, leading the communists to resume talks on October 25, 1951. After lengthy haggling with no lack of progress, the UN delegation declared an indefinite recess to armistice talks on October 8, 1952. Meanwhile, the body of Private First Class Emory Lawrence Bennett was returned to the United States on November 23, 1951, and buried with full military honors at Pinecrest Cemetery in Cocoa, Florida. He was survived by his parents, Sterling and Stella, and his three older brothers, Sterling Jr., Marvin, and John. On January 20th, 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower was sworn in as the 34th President of the United States. Like President Truman, he hoped for a diplomatic solution, and once again, armistice talks began on April 26, 1953. 3 months later, all sides, except for South Korea, agreed to the armistice. On July 27, 1953, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed by representatives of the United States, the People's Republic of China, and North Korea, ceasing hostilities and bringing an end to the Korean War. The armistice made possible the exchange of prisoners of war, as well as an opportunity to negotiate a peaceful settlement. Fast forward 71 years later, and that peaceful settlement still has not been reached, and the Korean peninsula remains divided along the 38th parallel. The main reason the United States got involved in the Korean War was to stop the first step in a communist campaign that could have easily spread all over the world if allowed to. Many people felt we should have never been involved in Korea, which is why it's often referred to as the Forgotten War. But keep this in mind. The end result of the Korean War was that North Korea was prevented from imposing its communist rule on South Korea. Unfortunately, that did not stop communism from eventually spreading across Central and Eastern Europe as well as Asia, which became known as the Eastern Bloc, thanks to the Soviet Union. Although the Korean War was relatively short, it was exceptionally bloody. In all, about 37,000 Americans lost their lives during the Korean War, and more than 100,000 were wounded and 8,000 were missing. South Korea sustained 1.3 million casualties, including 415,000 dead. Casualties among other United Nations forces totaled 16,500, including 3,100 dead. In December 1951, it was announced in several newspapers of the time that Private First Class Emory L. Bennett would be receiving the Medal of Honor for his heroic actions in Korea. On January 16, 1952, the Medal of Honor was presented to Sterling G. Bennett, father of Private First Class Emory L. Bennett, at the Pentagon by Secretary of Defense Robert Lovett. In addition to the Medal of Honor and Purple Heart, Emory L. Bennett was awarded the Bravery Silver Medal of Greece and the Distinguished Military Service Medal of Korea. In 1989, Emory L. Bennett's platoon lieutenant, Reamer Y. Brinson, who went on to initiate the recommendation for the Medal of Honor to be awarded to Emory, was asked if he remembered Bennett. He was the most dependable soldier I ever knew. He wasn't daring in that crazy way so many guys are. He was just reliable, and friendship meant something to him. Brinson also recalled that June day in 1951, when Bennett was killed. We came under attack by hundreds of Chinese troops. Nobody ordered Bennett to take this hilltop position. He just did it because that's how he was. He knew what it meant to his company. The enemy just threw it all at him then, but by God, 50 dead commies were laid out by Bennett. John Bennett, one of Emory's older brothers, had the following to say about his youngest brother in a newspaper article from January 1993. I guess if there is one thing I'd like for people to remember about my brother is that you could always rely on him. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you've learned something new today. Season 3 of Hidden History has explored the lives of veterans of the United States, as well as veterans of foreign countries historically connected to our nation. Many of their stories have been hidden in the pages of history and deserve to be told. Pictures, newspaper clippings, and links to external articles relating to a particular episode are available on our website, hiddenhistorypod.com. This has been the last episode of our podcast, Hidden History and Odyssey Through Time. And I would just like to thank all of our fans who have been with us from the start, as well as all of the new fans we picked up along the way. We released the first episode of this podcast in September 2022, along with the creation of our Instagram account, at Hidden History Pod. And now here we are 3 seasons later in May 2024. For me, this podcast was a personal journey, since I started it not only because of my love for history, but also because I needed a positive project to focus on. Just 6 months before this podcast even began, I was knocking at death's door and had to make a major change in my life. And so for the past 2 years, I have been maintaining my sobriety from alcohol while sharing bits of history with all of you through this podcast and our Instagram account. Anyone who lives a sober lifestyle will tell you that you need a strong support system in place, but for the past 2 years, as I've continued to share history with the world, I've been utterly alone. With the conclusion of this podcast, I plan on focusing on maybe finding some companionship in this crazy-ass world we live in. But fear not, this podcast may be over, but I still plan on sharing as much history with the world as possible. In the next few days, I will be releasing a video on Instagram just to wrap up these past 3 seasons of the podcast, maybe dive into my sobriety a bit, and share my plans for the future. In particular, our plans for the Hidden History Instagram account. If you are not already following us on Instagram, please go check out at Hidden History Pod. As for our website, hiddenhistorypod.com, every single episode of this podcast will be available to access at any time, and please check it out. For the true history nerds, each episode page on the website includes photos, documents, and newspaper clips not easily found online, along with articles and videos. The website will serve as the Hidden History Archives, as well as host our future projects. I also have a second Instagram account devoted to the Cold War, covering history between 1947 and the fall of the Soviet Union in December 1991. And now that the podcast is over, I will be posting a lot more on that account, so please go check out at Cold War Archives. Thanks again for listening. We truly appreciate all of you and hope we have shared some inspiration in a world seeped in uncertainty. I'm John Rodriguez, and until we meet again, and we'll definitely meet again, this has been Hidden History and Odyssey Through Time.